Hi, I am Sophia. When my sister stood on that stage, smiling under the bright lights, while people clapped for the future she claimed to have built, I did not feel anger the way most people would expect. I did not feel the urge to stand up or correct her. I did not feel the need to shout the truth. Instead, I felt something much quieter. I felt tired. Tired in a deep, steady way, like someone who has been carrying a heavy weight for years and finally realizes they are allowed to put it down. As the applause filled the room and cameras flashed in her direction, I sat still in my chair, hands resting calmly in my lap, and I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I knew something none of them did. The truth was already written, line by line, and it did not need my voice to be heard. I had written every line of code that made that company possible, every feature that investors praised, every silent fix that saved a launch from disaster. The product they called revolutionary was built in the quiet hours of the night, in a small room with peeling paint and a desk that wobbled every time I leaned forward. But on that stage, in front of a packed room of powerful people, my sister Quinn was the genius. She was the visionary. She was the face they trusted. I was invisible, and for a long time that invisibility felt normal. That day, though, as the demo began and the screen behind her flickered for just a moment too long, I knew that normal was about to end. I have always been more comfortable with machines than with people. Machines follow logic, they respond to truth. If something goes wrong, there is always a reason, and that reason can be found. People are harder. They smile while hiding things, they speak kindly while taking credit, they say we when they mean me. Growing up, this difference between my sister and me was treated like a harmless contrast. Quinn was loud, confident, and quick with words. I was quiet, observant, and happiest when solving problems no one else wanted to touch. Our parents joked about it often, especially at the dinner table. My father would laugh and say Quinn would run the world someday, and I would be the one fixing it behind the scenes. Everyone laughed, including me. Back then, I didn't understand how easily jokes can turn into expectations, and how expectations can turn into permission. The company began in a way that felt innocent at the time. I was still in college, deep into my computer science degree, barely sleeping and always thinking about systems and efficiency. I had an idea for a back-end framework that could automate workflows faster and cleaner than anything I had seen. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't something you could easily explain in one sentence, but it worked, and I knew it could change how companies operated. One night, sitting across from Quinn with takeout boxes between us, I explained the idea the best I could. She leaned forward, her eyes lighting up, already imagining the possibilities. She told me it was brilliant and that it could be huge. She said I should build it, and she would handle the talking, the pitching, the meetings. At the time, it sounded fair. I didn't enjoy explaining my work to people who wanted buzzwords instead of understanding. Quinn loved that world, so we fell into a pattern without ever discussing it out loud. As the company grew, that pattern hardened. I worked from home, from a spare bedroom that slowly turned into my entire world. The desk was cheap, the chair uncomfortable, and the window let in just enough light to remind me that the rest of the city was still awake while I worked through the night. I coded for hours without speaking to anyone, solving problems before they could become visible. I wrote systems that didn't crash under pressure, fixed bugs before users noticed them, and quietly carried the technical weight of a startup that was suddenly being called the next big thing. Quinn referred to it as the tech side, as if it were one department among many, not the foundation holding everything up. Quinn, meanwhile, moved fast and confidently through rooms full of people. She wore tailored jackets, practiced her smile, and learned exactly which words made investors nod. She spoke of vision, disruption, and scale, painting a picture so compelling that no one thought to ask what was underneath it. At conferences, she stood on stages under bright lights, while my name appeared in small internal documents and commit histories no one outside the company ever read. Occasionally, she would mention me on social media, calling me her genius sister, thanking me publicly in a way that looked generous. People loved it. It made her look kind and supportive. To me, it felt like being gently pushed further into the background, wrapped in compliments so I wouldn't notice the distance growing. The first time I sensed something was truly wrong had nothing to do with credit or recognition. It was the numbers. Numbers tell the truth if you listen carefully, and one night, while reviewing server costs and development expenses, I noticed patterns that didn't make sense. Budgets were higher than they should have been. Payments didn't match invoices. Marketing expenses seemed strangely personal. At first, I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is, until you realize you're the only one looking for it. Around the same time, Marcus announced his engagement to Quinn, a well-known venture capitalist who had already invested heavily in the company. The office celebrated. There were smiles, champagne, and congratulations. I stayed home that night, fixing a bug that no one else even knew existed. Marcus was different from other investors. He didn't dominate conversations or speak in buzzwords. He listened. The first real conversation we had was over a quiet lunch, where Quinn talked excitedly about growth and expansion, while I mostly listened. At one point, he turned to me and mentioned the commit logs, casually noting how quickly problems were resolved and how clean the fixes were. Most people didn't even know what a commit log was. That small observation told me more about him than any pitch ever could. It was the first time someone outside the company truly saw the work instead of the story around it.
As the product launch approached, pressure increased. Quinn promised features she didn't fully understand, features that existed only in slide decks. I worked late into the night turning those promises into reality, patching problems and strengthening systems stretched too thin. Then, the bugs started appearing, not randomly, but in ways that suggested deeper neglect. Marcus noticed. He didn't accuse or confront anyone. He watched, quietly. One evening, after another failed test run, he stayed behind and asked me a simple question in a calm voice. Had Quinn ever written code for the company? I answered honestly, no. The silence that followed said everything else. A few days later, he asked to review the commit history together. Sitting side by side, scrolling through years of work, my name appeared again and again, attached to fixes, features, and foundations. Quinn's name did not appear once. He didn't raise his voice or show anger. He simply nodded, slowly, as if something he had suspected was finally confirmed. At that moment, I still didn't know about the money, the accounts, or how deeply the truth ran. I only knew that something fragile had cracked, and that cracks, once formed, never stay small. That night, back in my small home office, rain tapped softly against the window as I stared at the glowing screen. I thought about family, loyalty, and how often silence is mistaken for weakness. I closed my laptop and, for the first time since the company began, allowed myself to rest. Somewhere deep inside, I understood that the truth was already moving, written clearly in the language I trusted most, and soon the world would have to read it. After that night, something shifted inside the company, even though nothing looked different on the surface. Meetings still happened, emails still flowed, smiles were still exchanged in hallways and video calls. But once you see a crack, you start noticing how carefully people step around it. I continued to work from my small home office, writing code, fixing bugs, and preparing for the upcoming product launch. But the quiet focus I once had was now layered with awareness. Every request felt heavier. Every promise Quinn made publicly felt like a private deadline she handed to me without asking. As the launch date grew closer, Quinn's behavior changed in small but noticeable ways. She became more controlling, more impatient, especially with things she did not fully understand. She wanted faster results without wanting to know how those results were achieved. She started forwarding investor emails to me late at night with short messages attached, asking if something could be quickly adjusted or easily added before the next demo. These requests were never framed as questions. They were expectations, wrapped in polite language. I rarely pushed back, not because I couldn't, but because I had been conditioned not to. For years, my role had been to make things work, no matter the cost. At the same time, Marcus began asking quieter, more careful questions. He never accused Quinn directly, and he never pressured me for answers. Instead, he observed patterns the way I observed systems. He noticed how often last-minute fixes saved public demos, and how those fixes always came from the same place. He noticed that Quinn spoke confidently about features, but avoided technical follow-up questions. When he did speak to me, it was always in private, always respectful, and always grounded in facts rather than emotion. He wasn't looking for drama, he was looking for truth. The pressure surrounding the wedding added another layer to everything. Quinn talked about it constantly, often mixing personal excitement with business conversations in a way that made me uncomfortable. She spoke about venues, guest lists, and luxury details in the same breath as funding rounds and launch timelines. What unsettled me most was how often she mentioned money without concern, as if it were endless. Around that time, I noticed more irregularities in the accounts. Development funds were being allocated to vague expenses. Large amounts moved quickly without the detailed approvals we once required. When I brought it up gently, Quinn brushed it off, saying she was handling it and that I shouldn't worry about things outside my role. That word, role, stayed with me. It was the first time she had ever clearly drawn a line between what was mine and what was hers. I realized then how narrow my space had become inside a company built on my work. I was trusted with the core systems, but excluded from decisions that shaped the future. I was essential, but not included. Valuable, but not visible. It was a quiet kind of isolation, one that doesn't announce itself until you're already standing alone. As rehearsals intensified, the product itself began to strain under the weight of promises made too quickly. Features were rushed, testing windows shortened. I worked longer hours, often late into the night, ensuring stability where I could. There were moments when I considered letting things fail naturally, stepping back and allowing the gaps to show. But each time, instinct took over. I fixed the problem. I always fixed the problem. It was what I had been trained to do, not just as an engineer, but as a younger sister who had spent her life cleaning up quietly. Marcus continued watching. One evening, after a long rehearsal that ended with polite applause and forced smiles, he stayed behind again. This time, he didn't ask about code, he asked about me. He asked how long I had been working this way and whether I had ever considered what I wanted outside the company. The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that before. I didn't have a clear answer. My identity had become so tightly wrapped around fixing and supporting that imagining something else felt unfamiliar, almost selfish.
A few days later, he requested access to more detailed financial records, framing it as routine due diligence before the next funding release. Quinn agreed quickly. Too quickly, her confidence unchanged. But I noticed the tension beneath it. Her messages became shorter, her tone sharper. She began checking in on my progress more frequently, asking not just about tasks, but about timelines in ways that felt less collaborative and more controlling. It was as if she sensed something slipping, even if she couldn't yet name it. As I reviewed system logs and prepared backups for the launch, I also began quietly documenting everything. Code histories, timestamps, bug reports, and internal messages were organized carefully, not out of spite, but out of instinct. Engineers document things. We preserve states. We leave trails. At the time, I told myself it was simply good practice. Deep down, I knew it was something else. It was self-preservation. The closer we came to launch day, the more fragile everything felt. The company's success rested on a narrative that could not survive scrutiny, and the systems beneath it were being stretched beyond what they were designed to handle. Quinn continued to play her part flawlessly in public, smiling for interviews and rehearsing her keynote speech with practiced ease. Watching her, I felt a strange mix of familiarity and distance. She was still my sister, the person I grew up with, but she was also someone I barely recognized anymore. On the night before the final demo rehearsal, I sat alone in my office again, surrounded by screens filled with logs and code. Outside, the city was quiet, lights reflecting softly on wet pavement after a brief rain. I thought about how many times I had chosen silence because it felt easier, kinder, safer. I thought about how often competence is mistaken for obligation, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if the truth was no longer hidden by my efforts. I didn't take action yet. I didn't confront Quinn. I didn't warn anyone. I simply kept working, knowing that the system was approaching a moment of stress it could not absorb forever. In engineering, we call it a breaking point, the moment when a structure reveals its true limits. As I saved my work and shut down my screens for the night, I understood that we were closer to that moment than anyone on stage realized. The breaking point didn't arrive quietly. It built like a pressure wave, subtle at first, then undeniable until it was impossible to ignore. I had always known Quinn's public persona was a construction, a performance designed to dazzle investors and journalists. What I hadn't anticipated was just how deep the cracks ran beneath it, how many corners had been cut, and how much of the company's foundation had been quietly siphoned into luxuries she felt entitled to. The first irrefutable evidence came late one night after hours of routine log checks and financial reconciliations. Marcus had sent me encrypted spreadsheets, and as I cross-referenced them with the internal accounts, a pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. Funds that should have gone to development, testing, and server upgrades had been quietly diverted to high-end travel, luxury boutiques, and a series of personal expenses that had no place in a startup budget. Every line, every number screamed betrayal. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel anger, but it was a measured, contained anger. Nothing loud, nothing impulsive. It was the kind of anger that sharpens focus and clarifies decisions. I knew that exposing Quinn recklessly would not serve the truth. It would only create chaos. Instead, I began documenting everything, meticulously, almost obsessively. Every misappropriated dollar, every line of code she never touched, every claim she had made in interviews that contradicted internal records. My fingers moved across the keyboard, compiling a quiet dossier that no one could dispute, a mirror reflecting reality back at the people who had been blinded by her charm. At the same time, Marcus became more present in subtle ways. He didn't confront Quinn, he didn't push me, he simply trusted the facts and waited for me to act when ready. I could sense the same quiet determination in him that I had in myself, the shared understanding that sometimes the truth has to arrive on its own terms. Over late-night calls and encrypted messages, we began coordinating a plan that relied not on aggression, but on clarity. We would let the system speak. The demo, the product, the very code that had been the company's backbone would be the instrument of revelation. I felt a strange satisfaction in that. The same tools that Quinn had relied upon to claim credit would now become her undoing, not because of sabotage, but because honesty is intrinsic to logic. A system cannot lie forever without breaking. The wedding added its own pressure. Quinn had blended personal and professional worlds so seamlessly that even our colleagues were caught in the illusion. Photos, invitations, lavish events, everything was financed indirectly by the money that should have supported the launch. Her confidence never wavered in public, but in private it became clear that she had underestimated the attention of someone who truly understood the mechanics behind the company. I noticed the subtle ways she double-checked schedules, adjusted budgets, and demanded status updates that previously would have been delegated. It was the first time she had felt the weight of accountability, even if she didn't yet realize it. Then came the final rehearsal before the launch, the day when everything we had been working toward would either shine or crumble. Quinn was on stage, rehearsing her lines and practicing gestures, while I was sitting backstage with Marcus, monitors open and code running in real time. I could feel the tension in the room, not just from the audience of staff and engineers, but from the invisible pressure of knowing that truth, once revealed, could not be undone. We did a dry run of the demo, carefully embedding the markers and triggers that would reveal the discrepancies. Every step was deliberate, precise. I did not smile, I did not speak. I simply watched as the pieces aligned, like a machine operating with perfect timing.
By the time the audience filed into the auditorium for the actual keynote, I had rehearsed every contingency. Every potential objection, every technical difficulty had been anticipated. Quinn remained unaware of the final adjustments, confident in her own ability to perform, relying on the applause she had assumed was guaranteed. The irony of it made my chest tighten with quiet satisfaction. She believed the stage and the lights belonged to her, but the real control, the real knowledge, resided in the code,
in the logic, and in the silent record of years of work she could never claim. The moment came with the first click of the presentation. Features appeared seamlessly at first, the audience impressed with the apparent polish. Then, as expected, the system began to highlight anomalies, bugs, and inconsistencies that no ordinary investor or journalist would have noticed, but patterns that anyone who examined the logs carefully could not ignore. The live feed of the application pulled data from our internal systems, revealing clearly which features were coded by whom and which budgets had been misappropriated. The presentation, meant to be a showcase of innovation, quietly became a display of truth. Faces in the audience shifted from admiration to confusion. Quinn's practiced smile faltered just slightly, imperceptible to most, but noticeable to anyone who knew her deeply enough. Her calmness had been her armor, but it was not code. Code is unyielding. Code cannot pretend. And the system was speaking. Marcus leaned slightly forward, watching not the audience, but me. There was no need for words. We had planned this precisely. I knew the moment the data revealed the financial discrepancies and her lack of contribution. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just the clean, undeniable reflection of reality in front of hundreds of people. The applause that came next was polite, uncertain. Investors murmured. Questions were whispered among staff. Media representatives scrambled to capture screenshots and notes, and Quinn, my sister, experienced for the first time a stage where the world saw beyond her performance. In that instant, I felt no triumph, no vindictive pleasure. Instead, I felt a profound release. Years of silent labor, of invisible dedication, of quiet patience were recognized in the simplest, most objective way possible. I had not broken the system. I had simply allowed it to function as it was designed to, revealing truth in the most elegant and undeniable manner. And as the audience processed what they were seeing, as Quinn struggled to regain composure, I understood something that went beyond professional satisfaction. I had reclaimed myself. I had reclaimed my contribution, and I had done it without losing the calm, measured control that had defined me for so long. By the time the presentation concluded, the implications were already clear. Investors pulled back, funding discussions halted, and the company's future was thrown into uncertainty. Staff whispered in corners, some looking relieved, others shocked. Quinn left the stage with her confidence shaken, her narrative dismantled, not by confrontation, but the relentless logic of evidence. And as she retreated to what she thought would be safety, I realized that the path ahead for me was no longer dictated by her choices. I had the freedom to step forward, to define my own trajectory, and to build something honest and entirely mine. The breaking point had arrived, and with it came clarity, liberation, and the quiet knowledge that the system, when trusted, will always speak the truth. After the keynote, the world seemed to pause for a moment, as if collectively trying to understand what had just unfolded. Investors who had once praised Quinn's vision began asking pointed questions. Colleagues whispered quietly in hallways, their voices hushed with the awareness that everything they had accepted as fact had been carefully constructed by someone else. The company that had seemed invincible, glossy, and unstoppable was suddenly fragile, a structure built on appearances rather than substance. In those quiet moments, I realized that change often arrives not with confrontation, but with inevitability. Systems, logic, and truth have a way of revealing themselves when given the chance. I had only allowed that process to unfold. I had only trusted the work I had done for years to speak for itself. Quinn disappeared from the public eye almost immediately after the incident. Meetings that were once dominated by her charm and confidence were suddenly filled with silence or confusion. Investors paused funding until thorough audits could be completed. Staff looked to me for guidance in technical matters, which felt strange but reassuring.
I did not step forward to claim power or position. I simply maintained the order that had always been my responsibility, ensuring that the systems she had exploited were stabilized and protected. In the background, Marcus coordinated with auditors, offering facts and records without drama, reinforcing the quiet narrative of truth that had already been revealed on stage. The result was not spectacle, it was clarity. In the days following the keynote, I was left to reflect on everything that had brought me to this point. Hours spent coding late at night, quiet conversations with mentors, and years of observing patterns in systems had led to this resolution. I realized how much I had allowed others to define my role, to limit my visibility, and to take credit for work I had done. But I also recognized that I had been patient, methodical, and careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for my own integrity. And in that patience, I discovered freedom. Freedom not just from Quinn's deception, but from the constraints I had unknowingly accepted over a lifetime. With clarity came opportunity. I decided to step away from the company that had been built on my labor but claimed by someone else. It was not a bitter departure, it was deliberate. I began planning a new venture, a startup founded on transparency, merit, and accountability. Every feature, every line of code, every decision would bear my mark openly and honestly. And because I had learned from the past, I understood the value of combining vision with execution, of balancing leadership with deep technical understanding. Slowly, methodically, the pieces of a new company came together, funded not by borrowed glory, but by the recognition that competence and integrity are valuable currency in themselves. As I built the new company, I noticed small changes within myself. I no longer questioned whether my work was seen or recognized. I no longer allowed others to define the boundaries of my contribution. And while Quinn's fall of grace was quietly acknowledged in industry circles, I did not dwell on it. There was no triumph in watching someone else stumble. The real satisfaction lay in the knowledge that I could create on my own terms, that my labor could flourish without being overshadowed, and that honesty and dedication could be both protective and liberating. The wedding, once a symbol of Quinn's charm and strategic alliances, became a footnote. Marcus continued to observe from the edges, his presence steady but not intrusive. He had been a quiet partner in the unfolding of truth, offering support without taking credit, and in that he mirrored the very principle that had guided me throughout my journey, that quiet competence, when respected, can accomplish more than flash and spectacle ever could. I realized that the real victory was not about exposing her publicly or seeing the company collapse. It was about reclaiming myself, honoring my work, and understanding that integrity has a weight and clarity that cannot be faked. Months later, when my new startup launched its first major product, the response was immediate and genuine. Investors, journalists, and early users recognized the substance behind the presentation. There were no staged smiles, no borrowed narratives. The work spoke for itself. And as I watched the first reports of adoption and positive feedback, I allowed myself a quiet smile, not of vindication, but of contentment. Years of patience, diligence, and careful observation had culminated not in revenge, but in justice, fairness, and opportunity. I had learned that silence can be a choice, observation can be strength, and trust in your own abilities can create freedom that no one else can take away. Looking back now, I understand that the story of the code thief is not merely about betrayal or corporate intrigue or even sibling rivalry. It is about patience, the power of competence, and the quiet triumph of integrity over pretense. I did not raise my voice. I did not stage a spectacle. I allowed the work itself, the very systems I had built, to reveal truth. And in doing so, I found not just a resolution for the company, but a path forward for myself. The lesson is simple, yet profound. Recognition will not always be given immediately, but integrity and dedication have a way of asserting themselves when the moment is right.
And when they do, the reward is not revenge, but freedom, clarity, and the ability to define your own path in the world.